Tonight on Need to Know, psychologists in our country and right here in our community say it's time to talk about racism in America. That's a topic that continues to challenge our ever-diversifying society. But mental health experts say these discussions must happen if we're going to move forward as a nation. Local psychologists join me to explain why. That's next. Also on the show, a Rochester lettering artist is sharing the stories of local entrepreneurs through a different perspective. Don't go anywhere. Need to Know starts right now. Have lived with racial division in our country since the birth of America. And while many may acknowledge those divides, people have a hard time talking about race and understanding the impact of racism on individuals, varied racial groups, and our society as a whole. Recently, the American Psychological Association launched an effort solely focused on getting people to talk about the racial divides in our nation. We're talking conversations in the classroom, the workplace, the salon, at church, and more. Joining me to explain why these discussions need to take place and the connection between race, racism, and health are esteemed psychologists from the Rochester region. Dr. Ronke Lattimore-Tapp, Assistant Director for Multiculturalism at the University of Rochester's University Counseling Center. Dr. Jessica Moore, a pediatric and family psychologist with practices at the URMC Institute for the Family and Rochester Regional Department of Pediatrics. And Dr. Keisha Bell, Senior Instructor of Psychiatry and Obstetrics and Gynecology at UR Medical Center. And welcome to all of you. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
So I'm sure there are a few viewers and they heard my host tease for this conversation. They were thinking, oh my gosh, why race? It is such a tangled, mangled web. What's the point? So if we remain reticent about race, what happens to our society? And Ronke, I'll give that to you first.
Me first, yeah. So part of what happens is we stay stuck. You know, we are racial beings, we have a racial identity, and whether we openly acknowledge that or not, it still impacts just about everything in our life, sometimes more openly and saliently and sometimes subtly. But so if we don't pay attention to it, then when we are in our field trying to help people, we're often missing a key part of what might be going on that's impacting someone's mental health. And I shouldn't even say might, I think we often do miss a huge part because we already know from certain research and findings and just working with people that racial stress and the kind of history of discrimination and the ways that that can impact everything from finances to your education of yourself or your children and all of that, that adds a level of stress that you're dealing with on top of anything and everything else someone might come in to deal with. And so that's in the subcontext, at least, if it's not the main thing someone's come in to talk about. And so we do have to talk about it, and I think we need to talk about it in all the different fields. It's uncomfortable, yes, which is part of what you talked about, and so often the conversations get stuck or we want to avoid it because, you know, well, that's uncomfortable, so let's just sit it aside and, you know, tell me about your mother or tell me about something else that's going on when, you know, we can probably find something to talk about in anybody's family, but that might not be the main thing that you're dealing with if there's everything else around in your society and culture impacting you.
Just to take a little bit of a step back, as psychologists, why is this topic of race and this effort that we have now with the APA to really push these conversations and move them forward, why is this personally important to you?
I think it's personally important to me because I am someone who is a woman of color. And I work with other women of color in my practice, and understanding or trying to understand, we'll never fully understand our patients' backgrounds, but as much as we can, understanding where they're coming from and taking a comprehensive view of their lives. I think it's important for me because I don't want to miss something that is salient to them because that will inform my treatment. And also, as someone sitting across from them who is a woman of color, that means something to them to see someone like me in this position. And so it matters on both of those fronts for me.
Jessica, what about you?
You know, it's really important to me too. I think beyond clinical work, absolutely in clinical work, but also in teaching and interprofessional conversations and collaborations. I think there's so much that I could miss if I don't take a minute and think about what is going on in me and what biases I have that might make me misunderstand something that somebody's doing, or totally oblivious to a dynamic that's in the room for somebody else and not for me, or vice versa. And I, you know, as a clinician, I have a role of power in the room because I'm the doctor in the room giving care. As a supervisor or educator, I have that power. As a colleague, I don't always have that power, but I'm a collaborator. And so in all those roles, I think it's really important to think about those things so that you can be the best clinician, educator, colleague that you can be. And it really takes some look inside yourself, too.
I'm going to echo some of what they said because I think it's important on different levels. There's a personal level of just understanding myself, my own healing and health and growth, being a parent, that of my children, and helping them to begin to understand who they are, encounter sometimes the lack of talking about this that might happen in schools and in their education, you know, when they come back asking certain questions or relaying something that they took away from class, and I'm like, wait, that's not exactly right. You know, where are you in that picture? Or let's clarify this, because that builds their sense of who they are, and that's going to impact everything in terms of their mental health, their self-esteem, their cultural esteem, their academic performance, and on and on and on. And then it's important on all those different professional levels. You know, I'm thinking, for example, that one of the premises of the talk that I did recently on White Theory, Black Client was about this idea that I found myself, you know, I wanted to give the best care possible. And I found myself often sitting with people of color and thinking that all of my training and the stuff that I learned about how to work with someone wasn't quite hitting it. You know, I knew something was missing, and I was trained that way too. So I had to go back and look in some other places to start to go, you know, how do we need to talk? How can I help you in this way? And to grow in those skills. And that needs to start being integrated from the start. That shouldn't be something that after I've gotten my degree or I'm toward the end of my degree and I'm working with people and I start going, something doesn't feel right here in terms of this isn't hitting what you're talking about, but I don't have any other theories or strategies that I've been taught, that I've been supervised, that I've, you know, developed. You know, I'm flying by the seat of my pants here and going by some other things that maybe I learned just growing up, some of which might be really great and some of which might have come from a place of some intergenerational trauma and isn't the most helpful. So we really need to look at this on all levels.
You mentioned the word trauma, and that kind of brings me to this concept of health and the connection between race, racism, and health. I think that sometimes the general public may not necessarily understand how these things connect and why. So explain how that happens. How does it connect? Jessica?
Sure. You know, I think that first of all, there's disparities in who the providers are in the room, and me included. When I walk into the room, I bring my face and my gender, my face, my skin color, and sometimes that doesn't. Most times, it doesn't match the person walking into the room, and so already there's a divide there that if I don't bridge it, if I don't ask about it or talk about it or think about it, I could miss something as the clinician and give them care that is not ideal or not the same care that I could give somebody that I might have more in common with in the room, or at least perceived in that way.
What are some of the types of things? I know obviously you can't share specifics because of these are your patients, but what are some general things that might come up that are related to issues that come about, health issues in relation to race and racism?
I work with kids mostly, and so I can give some sometimes funny anecdotal stories. But one thing that comes up, when I was integrated into primary care, a lot of work around obesity, and there's a huge problem with childhood obesity. And depending on your cultural background or your intersectionality, feedback from your physician could sound very different, right? And there's different ideals across racial divides and ethnic divides and cultural divides around how to take care of somebody with food, and what an ideal body image looks like. So there's been plenty of cases where the family's gotten feedback about a child being overweight or obese, because that's a word that might be used on their after visit summary, and they're upset about it, and didn't say something in the room, partly because of that power differential. Well, how do I tell a physician in their white coat what I'm thinking? But when they go home, there's like, why would I follow this recommendation? It feels like an insult when the sentiment on the medical end is really just to help. And so, in some ways, bringing race up there and talking about, well, what does food mean in your family, and what kinds of foods talk to you about who you are as an individual, can really help kind of soften that a little bit and move a conversation forward.
Well, as I mentioned in my introduction, the American Psychological Association launched this initiative really in support of meaningful conversations around race and racism. And part of this effort is a video series that's available online. There's discussion guides for educators and for leaders. And I want to share one woman's story with you and with our viewers, and we'll take a look at that.
One of the experiences that stands out to me the most, that I think has affected me even into higher ed, was in high school. I had a class, I was an honors English class, and I grew up in a area that there's not a lot of minorities. There's maybe like 10 of us in my graduating class. And so when I walked into the classroom in front of the whole class, the teacher asked me, was I in the wrong room? And I said no, and being in high school, I'm like, checking my schedule, like, no, I think I'm in the right classroom. And so she said, no, this is an honors class. I don't think you're in the right room. And so I looked at my schedule and I looked around. And my mother used to be a teacher, and I have a bunch of siblings, so we've been through that high school. And I'm like, I recognize the people in this classroom. And so she looked at my schedule and then told me to have a seat. And for the rest of the semester, I got lower grades than everybody in the class. To the point that I had a partner who was not Black, who spoke up for me in class on a project. I literally got a lower grade than her, letter grade. And it got to the point where my mom had to go up to the school and they had to have a parent-teacher conference. But for me, it was just a really humiliating experience. Like, there wasn't anything that I did wrong. There wasn't anything that I could have done differently. And I felt like it left a stain on me in every educational endeavor. I always feel like I need to prove that I need to be there.
How can an experience like that shape someone's worldviews? And I'm curious, how can something like that impact the choices? That's clear racial discrimination, impact the choices that someone might make positively or negatively that can impact their overall health.
So in terms of mental health, especially, and it also relates to physical health because the stress and the like builds up, but in terms of mental health, I mean, that's such a sadly common story for students that come in, that in some way they've been questioned or feel like they don't quite belong. Students who are brilliant and smart look at their peers and they picked up messages, maybe explicitly, in this way, you don't belong here, and also subtly, just throughout. Well, I just mentioned the example of my children coming home, and they're in elementary school. I mentioned they range from 4 to 9. And so when they go through an entire educational system and don't quite see themselves in the picture, and all they really learn about what they've achieved is slavery, which isn't quite an achievement, surviving through slavery, yes, but it's a different label and connotation that they're kind of coming away with. And then sports and music, stuff like that, they start to question too, can I really do this? Do I have what it takes? At the same time, they've been taught about every other group almost, learning things, achieving things, being smart, being the originators of things. And so you get to school and that's already there. And then you have these different experiences, and it can be what we call crazy making. You start that doubt, wondering, can I really do this? Am I really smart enough? Do I belong here? It seems like it comes easier to everybody else. All of these different things, and that sits with someone. And part of her, when she said, for the rest of the semester, I got bad grades, or lower grades. Part of that could have been the teacher, just not seeing or being more critical and grading more harshly. Part of it could have been just the impact of that stereotype threat and how much that anxiety and that stress and that I have to do so well, I have to do so well. If I don't, this is going to reflect poorly on me and on all black people or on all people of my identity, that starts to get in the way. That's taking up so much mental space that you have less available to actually do the work. And so sometimes that causes our performance to go down, which then reinforces the, see, I can't do this as well, I'm not as good, I don't, and it's a vicious, horrible cycle that has a lot of people just struggling.
Sorry. And then if you don't have other people to talk to about that, if you're the only one and you're struggling with that, that can then lead to some negative coping behaviors, you know, drinking or drug use or other things that will then impact your mental and physical health. So it's kind of a rippling effect that we see.
Something that's come up, I've heard it twice, race-related stress. That might be new for some people. Keisha, can you explain what that is, what that means?
Race-related stress, from my understanding, are stressors that have to do with a person's race. So things, for example, those microaggressions that accumulate over time. Everyone has, you know, a certain amount of stressors. There are things like food poverty or, you know, difficulty accessing, you know, healthcare, things like that. Those are stressors that a lot of people can experience, but those race-related stressors are things that have to do with your particular race. What are you? You know, where are you really from? You know, things like that. That you.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. What are you?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Oh, your hair is so curly for your skin to be so dark. You know, like things like that that you experience in multiple settings, and it accumulates over time, and it can contribute to, you know, the stress that we see when people are walking into our office.
In what ways can and should we all participate in healthy and appropriate conversations about race and the racial divides that we have in our country?
I think it first starts at home, having that internal dialogue with yourself, like Ronke was talking about, being able to have a frank conversation with yourself about what are my biases, what are my prejudices, what are the things that make me uncomfortable when we talk about race or religion or culture or things like that, and allowing yourself to kind of sit with that discomfort, acknowledge that that's there before, you know, going towards conversation with other people, because it is an emotionally charged conversation oftentimes, and if you're not aware of these things within yourself, then you can, you know, make the situation much worse than if you had a little bit of reflective time. Now that's fearful for people because then you're afraid of what you might learn about yourself.
Right. And then there's that person who does that and takes the time to process and then says, okay, I've heard about this, I've thought about this, but why does that mean that I need to talk about this? Because perhaps my perceptions or my experiences may come across negatively in a conversation. And doesn't that make things worse? Can't that further divide something that we're trying to bridge? So what do you then say to that person?
Dr. DeGruy has a great quote about it's the secrets that make us sick. And so often when we're not talking about things and holding things in, even in supervision, I think there's a quote someone has said that, you know, it's not that you have particular feelings or reactions that's bad, it's when you don't talk about them that we end up, because it's not like they go away, it's just that they continue to have impacts without any attention or catching or addressing. And that's kind of what's happened. We want to be good people, and because if you're caught on anything that feels racial, it feels like, oh my goodness, you're saying I'm a bad person, as opposed to your person who has been impacted by growing up in this country and the messages here just like everybody else, and you're just trying to address that and move forward. When we can pay attention to that and begin to talk about and move forward, you're really not going to be able to change or address anything that you're not willing to acknowledge or talk about. I mean, that's what therapy is. We're talking about all sorts of difficult things that people have held and not wanted to talk about, and that's part of why they're stuck. We have to talk about it to move forward.
And I think it's the intention also. You know, we think that if we have this conversation, there's going to be this huge change that will occur in this moment, and then, you know, everything will be rainbows and roses and people walking in the fields. And that isn't necessarily what will happen. Even the experience of being heard can be emotionally corrective. And so if if your intent is to go into these conversations to discover and to hear, rather than to try to defend or to deflect, that can be life-changing for someone to feel I was heard. Someone who I didn't think would ever understand or try to understand me, I was heard, and that can be really impactful.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add that I know that as a white woman coming into some of these conversations, I've been incredibly intimidated, and Keisha and I have talked a lot about this in our own dialogue. And what I've kind of discovered through some looking in at myself is that if I don't, then the onus is on the other person to have to bring it up, which is really inherently unfair. And I think part of the problem. And so pushing yourself is really important in these ways.
Well, unfortunately, we have to close for now, but we could spend much more time on this. A special thank you to my guests for your insight and your time on a topic that cannot be ignored in our community. To learn more about how to have these conversations about race and racism so they're meaningful and effective, go to the American Psychological Association's website, apa.org. There's a discussion guide and videos to help facilitate these dialogues in the classroom, the office, and elsewhere. Lettering artist and entrepreneur Michaela Schramm is breathing new life into the traditional world of blogging. She's collecting the stories of fellow entrepreneurs in Rochester and translating their real-life experiences into pieces of digital art that live on her blog. It's called the JSD Perspective. The name is inspired by Schramm's company, Jade and Stone Design. Her goal is to help people learn from and connect with the stories of local entrepreneurs pursuing their dreams. Schramm says she's learned through this project that we all have more in common than we may realize. Here's her story.
My name is Michaela Schramm. I am the owner of Jade and Stone Design. It's a typography and lettering company. It focuses mainly on signage for weddings, businesses, logos, anything with type we focus on. I wanted to challenge myself because I have 4 kids and I wanted to do something for myself, something that was new, something I had never done, and I always like to have my hands in a few different things, so starting lettering was my challenge, my focus, and one thing led to another and I started getting really good at it, and it got really exciting for me that people wanted work done by me, and so it just kind of took off from there. In 2018, last year, I had this idea that I wanted to get to know other business owners and influencers within our area and possibly outside of the Rochester area as well. So I was just going to start this art blog. The JSD Perspective is an art blog where I reach out to these business owners and influencers that I personally look up to, but also I see that the community looks up to, and I go over an interview with them. I'm here to see Stacy and just have a normal conversation. So where would you like us to set up? And from there, I take all these different quotes and things that they have said and translate it into artwork. So I'm taking a new form of typical blogging with writing and turning it into an art form. So then from there I'm making about 6 different entries for each person, explaining who they are from my perspective, the JSD perspective.
I just like to have fun and play with colors.
The reason why I picked Stacy of Stacy K Floral was because I really look up to her and her shop.
I love business in general. I love numbers, and I like to have fun and play with colors.
I loved taking in all the different floral arrangements that were there because that helps me see her creative side and what she enjoys doing and what her creative outlet is, and kind of putting myself within her shoes is kind of interesting to kind of picture myself, you know, if I was running this business, how would I feel? You know, what is it that I love? What is it that, you know, I almost in a sense putting myself in her shoes of what would I change, you know, just having that perspective of seeing what she sees every day.
As far as like more the wedding and event side of things, I find inspiration from magazines or art books.
After I do the interview, I kind of take in everything that we just talked about. I'll look throughout the business if I'm there, or if we're chit-chatting a little bit at their home, because I'll also do the interviews at their house too if they'd prefer. And from there, I'll kind of let it settle in. I'm going through and writing down all the quotes that I like. It kind of looks a little bit scratchy because I'm all over the place of changing things and rewriting within my notepad. And then from there is when I really get started and dive into my iPad, because everything is digital, and I'll just start drawing. Some things that I'm kind of thinking for the design of Stacy's interview and her whole collection, just in general, thinking about what really inspired me about her business and herself. When she talks, she smiles a lot. She has a lot of passion about her family and where her husband came from. So I'm kind of taking all those different colors and feelings and kind of stepping stones and putting that into my design. I feel like that's going to be the focal point. The JSD perspective has really challenged me because it's taken me outside of my comfort zone. I usually do lettering and typography, and a lot of this is illustration. So I wanted to do this to hone in on my art skills and get better with it, but that's a huge challenge in itself, because if you're trying to push yourself to learn something new or get better at it, that leads to different challenges, I guess, mentally. I want the community to see that those people that I'm interviewing go through all the same emotions that we do, and that nobody's perfect, nobody has everything completely figured out, and that it shows who they are and maybe something that the community didn't know about that person.
My mother-in-law lives with us, and she helps take care of the kids. So that, I think I'm so blessed to have something that my mom didn't have, and knowing every day, I get emotional even talking about it.
Whether they have kids or they're helping someone in their family deal with something, or, etc. There's different layers to people's lives, so I want to show that to Rochester.
To check out Michaela Schramm's work and track her latest entrepreneur profiles, go to jadenstonedesign.com and click on JSD Perspective. And that wraps up another edition of Need to Know, Rochester's News Magazine. I'm your host, Helene Bianduti Hofer. Thank you for joining me tonight and throughout the weekend right here on WXXI TV. I'll see you next week.